Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Paula Randolph. I'm with the Babbitt Center for Land and Water Policy here in Phoenix. We're going to turn a little bit right now. We've had a lot of policy and background, and we're going to get a little bit more personal. I'd like to introduce you to Brett Jaspers, our moderator today. He is a senior correspondent with the local NPR station. And we have very personal stories from Colorado, some rural stories probably from New Mexico, and a business perspective from California. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Brett. Thank you.
Thank you all for being here. This is Paul Bruchet, Terry Bruner, and Kirsten James. And I would like to get into the questions as soon as possible, but I'd like to ask each of them to just give us 3 or 4 sentences of, what do you do? What are you about? In 3 or 4 sentences, please.
My name is Paul Bruchet, and I'm a 5th generation ag producer from Colorado. A little bit of a unique perspective on agriculture for the state. My family homestead is on the Front Range, kind of between Denver and Boulder. We relocated up to the headwaters of the Colorado River in the year 2000, just in time for an epic drought, where we became very involved in water-related situations. So I earn my living in a day-to-day as a cow-calf operator and a fishing guide, and continue to work on water-related matters.
I'm Terry Bruner, and I run an organization called Grow New Mexico, and we started a couple of years ago. A few former Obama administration officials put together this group to try to bridge the capacity gap in New Mexico organizations applying for and receiving funding for their projects. In the administration, I was running USDA's rural development programs for New Mexico, where we had millions of dollars available for drinking water systems and wastewater treatment plants and such, and economic development and housing. But New Mexico utilizes federal funding sources at a far lower rate, and foundation sources and nonprofit lenders at a far lower rate than most states. So we apply grant writers, financial analysis, planning, and other skills that small communities and organizations might need to get the funding they need to complete their projects.
Hello, I'm Kirsten James, and I'm the California Policy Director with the Sustainability Nonprofit Series. Series is actually celebrating our 30th anniversary this year, so we've been around for a long time, but a lot of folks don't intimately know what we work on. So specifically, we're working to mobilize corporate and investor leadership around sustainability challenges, but also opportunities on things like climate change and water resources. And I lead our California public policy program called Connect the Drops, where we bring businesses, many consumer-facing brands that you all have heard of, and also investors into the public policy discussions around water and climate.
Thank you all very much. The panel is about compromise or finding common ground. I guess I wanted to, we're kind of in this moment where we're celebrating a lot of compromise. The drought contingency plan is being presented to Congress right now. The legislation is happening, but people seem to really love compromise whenever it happens. They talk about it, they congratulate themselves for it. So I guess I'm wondering, why is it so hard to get to? Like, why isn't it easier? I don't know, Kirsten, if you want to start off with that.
Sure. Well, from the public policy perspective, I had a mentor who told me, don't ever let the perfect be the enemy of the good when it comes to public policy. So, I mean, it's such a sausage-making process when you're going through development of any kind of legislation. And so you really have to think about the bigger picture and the longer term. And yes, I previously worked at a more traditional environmental nonprofit, and we were, the very left side leaning of a public policy, going, as far as we could to the quote left. And, we needed that also, further right to then actually, come to the middle. And sometimes you do have to cut bait. Sometimes, there's death by 1,000 cuts, and, the public policy just gets so weak that it's not worthy of support. But, you do sort of need to find that middle ground.
So maybe I'm understanding you incorrectly, but you're saying that having a complement on the other, that is farther on the other side, kind of allows, like having that as a precondition actually allows you to have a place to land. Is that
Yeah, I mean, I think that's what we've witnessed a lot of times in California policy, and not to say that, the middle is where I personally or my organization would personally want to land, but I think sometimes that is just what happens when you have groups sort of at both ends of the spectrum, and then, the decision makers then can sort of help develop that compromise when you have those two sort of polar opposites. And, sometimes the stakeholders can work it out together. There's plenty of examples like that, but sometimes it's the decision makers that actually are the ones that are, coming to that compromise.
Mm-hmm. Terry, if people want compromise, why are we coming right up to a shortage declaration before we have a DCP? Like what if we want compromise, why is it so hard to get to?
Well, there's a variety of factors. I worked in the U.S. Senate for the senator who ran the Energy Committee back when we were passing energy bills. And energy bills are really complex, and they put together all sorts of different sides of interest groups from across geographies and across the nation, and different types of cultural groups and such. And it's really difficult. And I don't know if we could pass something like that these days. It's so hard on the political side to get people together. And it's always ironic to me in an era where we have such awesome communication methods that we are such bad communicators with each other. And I think that the information flow, and this is why this conference is so important with journalists, is to get the information out there to all the groups that are considering something like this. These conversations that we have become really heady, really fast, and can sometimes get far beyond where the public is and the public's understanding of things. So we have to be sure that these intricate topics are filtering down to folks in a sense so they can grasp them, and then demand of these folks, the policymakers or whatnot, that they seek out consensus and get things done.
Mm-hmm. So it's the public, the general public, that is the instrument of compromise that you say, and getting kind of like convincing them of that, or like access, just getting into their brain is the barrier.
That is, I mean, the world is getting increasingly complex, and the subject matter gets more and more complex. And so bringing people to the table and understanding these issues in a long-term way. I mean, so much of what we do is instantaneous, and we're asking people to make decisions right now. And that sometimes leaves out the thoughtfulness that you have with duration and time. So you really want to try to educate the public and bring them along and constantly be staying in touch. I was thinking earlier today in some of the discussions, in New Mexico, all we talked about in the 90s was water. All we talked about up to the recession was water. But then the recession came, and we didn't care about water anymore. And all we talked about was jobs. And so how do you get water back up into people's minds when they're so concerned with just getting to work every day? And so you really have to constantly put this in front of people. That's why the work of journalists and others and public policy makers is so important, to keep ringing the bell and saying this is something we all need to be thinking about.
Paul, your story is really interesting because it's like bread and butter, personal, dealing with like very specific families in your area. Can you like tell that story a little bit, and then talk about maybe why compromise was actually possible, or maybe this question I asked these other two, like why was it hard in your particular instance? What were the barriers that you were kind of working up against?
Yeah. So locally where we are, on the main stem of the Colorado River, the Colorado Big Thompson project, when it was constructed, through Senate Document 80, we were labeled the irrigators of the lands in the vicinity of Kremling. We use the acronym ILVK now, and we have a dance that goes along with it. It's really cool later when we're hanging out.
He'll do that later. You'll do it later, right?
But during different periods of history, those group of landowners that were given specific water rights had kind of mobilized together for a common cause, and every time they were significantly defeated. When the drought of the early 2000s happened, I think that the compromise was based on a need, senior water rights on the upper Colorado River with fixed station pumps sitting high and dry in a river system was a scary day for producers, and action needed to take place. Given what had happened in the past, the first thing that we wanted to do was have some kind of an assessment so that we could speak very accurately as to what was occurring within the river system and what our needs were. But on that topic of compromise with barriers, you know, in the early stages of that project, there was a landowner who told me if I ever said the words Trout Unlimited back to back on his ranch again, he'd run me off his place. That same landowner has now had Trout Unlimited act as a fiscal agent for 3 different grants and projects that he's installed on his place, both for the sustainability and production of his place as an agricultural operation, and the structures that are designed to increase the health of a river system. And so with some model projects that have been put into place, kind of gained steam and head with that. But also for the landowner's sake, I think that one of the more important things is that through history, it was kind of a group of ranchers with a really terrible acronym name working together without any capability of leverage. And immediately we started working with Grand County and local government on a more significant level. We had partners step in American Rivers and Trout Unlimited and different foundations from around the state, Colorado Water Conservation Board, and all of a sudden, you know, we're rolling to a place where now that partnership was able to grow to where now we're working with water utilities that Trans Mountain diverts some of that water flow that natively should be running through our ranches to the Front Range, and we're able to build this partnership.
Mm-hmm. That landowner who told you not to say the words Trout Unlimited together, like what changed his mind? Can you get specific with that? I mean, maybe you don't know exactly what it was, but maybe you do.
Well, the first grant that we received, we needed a qualifying entity that would actually be able to receive the grant and act as a fiscal agent, and Trout Unlimited offered. And so there was an opportunity there to work forward or not. It was a clear decision to be made. And I think that instantly when he knew that the motivation was not to exclusively look at it just from a river habitat trout perspective, but there was a way, there was a common damage to the river system that needed addressed for all things. And that kind of became one of the slogans of our project, is that, you know, healthy rivers need healthy ranches, and healthy ranchers need healthy rivers.
So did he kind of ever address that again to say, oh, I was wrong before?
Oh yeah, he wears TU ball caps to our meetings. I actually have fishermen fishing his place today, and he kind of loves it. He's had a very big shift in his mentality. I think that honestly, over the time, he just kind of felt beat up. And I think that this has been very inspiring and rejuvenating for him to understand that there's more to the river system than just operating his pump.
That's interesting. Kirsten, the California drought, I want to ask you a little bit about that, because that had like a beginning, middle, and end. Well, not an end, but a beginning and a middle, and we're in this post-middle period, right? I actually read the other day that there's no more drought. So
right?
congratulations.
Officially, first time in 7 years, I think. Yeah.
But through that arc of going through that, did groups change their relationships with each other? Can you kind of tell that story a little bit? How did they specifically change how they related to each other on that issue?
Yeah, so I mean, my program, Connect the Drops, was formed sort of year 1 of the drought. So, you know, everyone was calling us, a lot of our company partners, and really recognizing that, you know, hey, we could be in trouble here. We could be having to reduce, you know, our water use and our operations and our supply chain. And then, of course, soon thereafter, we had Governor Brown issue an emergency declaration where some of that became a reality. So for us, you know, it was great in the public policy arena because we saw a lot of people turn their attention. Water was front and center in the headlines. You know, every week you could identify a top news story on water, and it was just in the headlines, and that's what the decision makers are reading. And so, you know, our program got more and more interest, and we made more and more headway in the public policy space. We got our Sustainable Groundwater Management Act finally approved in 2014. Many folks say if it weren't for sort of the looming severity of the drought, you know, that might not have gotten to the finish line. So, you know, we've seen during this last 7 years, more and more stakeholders coming to the table and really recognizing that, you know, they're experiencing impacts right now. You know, we had businesses that actually had to source almonds elsewhere outside of California because they could not source them during the California drought. So they were maybe for the first time in memory, experiencing real effects to their business. And so, we did see more and more public policy makers coming to the table around some of these key issues.
Did those businesses or certain policymakers then all of a sudden kind of behave differently towards groups that they maybe just a year prior or a couple years prior kind of never talked to? I guess, like, how did the behavior change?
Well, I think it changed a lot because the businesses that we work with through Connect the Drops, and just to give you a flavor of who those are, so, it's food and beverage companies like General Mills and hospitality companies like Hilton, and tech companies that have data centers that use a lot of water. So, many different parts of the California economy really realized that they couldn't just focus their public policy discussions on taxes and, the traditional business, policies that they're talking to folks in Sacramento about, but they needed to join Ceres and it was a business imperative that they start talking about these public policies around water. And so prior to this time, we saw very, very few instances of the business community or the investor community ever talking to folks in Sacramento about these issues. And so it was very eye-opening. I would just be observing in some of these public policy discussions when we would take our company partners up to Sacramento, and, it took a second for the legislators to understand, why is Coca-Cola here, talking to us about water, and so I think it was a change, and I think the companies are starting to see that, we've got to continue this. Even this year was a very heavy rain year, but we, need to remain vigilant, and the next drought is around the corner. So in a way, the fact that the drought is over is not necessarily all that helpful in the public policy stage, but, that's one of our jobs, is to keep the momentum, and that this is a long-term issue.
Mm-hmm. There was something on the first day of the 10X conference, somebody asked a question, maybe I'll just kind of re-ask it to this group, like, do we need a crisis in order to do anything? And somebody on the panel that I saw was like, yeah, like, that's how it's going to happen, a crisis. Terry, like, does a crisis change then who people are actually willing to talk to, work with? It's like having an acute need is what we're all going to need in order to, like, get anything done.
Yeah, unfortunately, I think it does take a crisis. We had a group of businesses in Albuquerque get together just a few years back to focus on forest thinning way up in the Chama Wilderness, which is hours away from Albuquerque, for the sole purpose to protect the Albuquerque water supply. And so they put together the pieces that if you have a catastrophic forest fire, you're going to impact the water supply of a large metropolitan area. Otherwise, they hadn't expressed any concern for that forest area. So you do see that happening when you have these natural events occur, where suddenly people get around them. And I think we're kind of coming out of a drought. It looks like we are in New Mexico. And one of the agriculture secretary for New Mexico told me that farmers will readjust after that event. They'll kind of assess what they learned from the prior drought, try something different this time around to prevent it happening again to them or whatever. So I think it's unfortunate, but we do reach these crisis situations where we have to adjust.
And I'll just say, sort of one counter to that Ceres is trying to change the paradigm with businesses and investors. They're savvy, they're doing the numbers, they're doing long-term projections. And so, yes, a crisis is helpful in many ways and does spur a lot of action. But, if we have these, business folks that are looking at long-term jobs, long-term economic growth, and really facing reality and penciling out, some of this, hopefully it will change the paradigm, and it won't just be a crisis that folks are reacting to, but it'll just be the normal business that this is incorporated into their long-term strategy.
Mm-hmm. I mean, yeah, because like just in the last panel, we saw that Dave's comment about everything's changed, but our policy making, how we go about doing that hasn't changed. I don't know if Terry or Kirsten, if you had any thoughts about that, being people who are in that realm.
Yeah, I mean, like I said, a crisis really helped free up some log jams with some of the public policies. But, I think all of the stakeholders can help keep decision makers sort of eye on the prize and talking about the long term. And, our organization is helpful in bringing up some of the economic and job sort of points to ensure that decision makers, are looking at more of the long term. But it is hard. I mean, in Sacramento, they're juggling a lot of important issues right now, housing and homelessness. And so it is hard to keep, it elevated. But, all of the stakeholders in the room and, media covering the importance of these issues, I think, will hopefully help spur some of that continued momentum and linking issues, linking climate and linking food supply and linking water. And linking, housing, and they're all related. So how can we, if Governor Newsom is now focusing on housing, how can we, work that
attach your water thing to the
yeah,
housing?
or vehicle miles traveled with, we work on climate issues as well. So how can we, reframe, our end goal just in a different way that gets attention?
Yeah, and I would say, you see this happening, and you see local leaders starting to pivot on how they approach some of these issues. We do some work for the mayor of Albuquerque. Your new mayor in Phoenix, an Albuquerque native, by the way, is I think a good, hopeful step forward for this town. In that these new leaders, I don't know if you want to call them millennials or whatnot, are having thoughts of that broader perspective of things. So when the mayor of Albuquerque makes a decision on local foods or on parks or zoning, he has a sustainability group he consults. He thinks about it in terms of climate change and what else is happening in the world around him, rather than just making these decisions just in and of themselves and thinking about the broader policy implications. I also just want to stress that to make progress on these issues, I think across the country, whether it's these particular water issues or land issues, we have to learn to talk to other people. And that's one thing that's striking when you get out into rural communities across the nation, particularly I find it in New Mexico, and you find that the rural communities are having a completely different conversation often. And no one from the urban community is willing to go out and talk to the people in the rural community, and vice versa. There's more of a divide than ever in these discussions, and that prevents finding consensus on things, but also prevents the flow of information getting to the people it needs to get to. So I'm a big advocate for people going out and talking to people they don't normally talk to. If you find yourself consistently surrounded by water attorneys, go talk to somebody else. It might be refreshing. No, but I think you get out beyond your normal boundaries to educate folks and talk to them, discuss issues, find out what they're feeling and experiencing, and that will educate yourself in understanding how to better approach these issues and such. But it's the one scary thing that I think we saw in the Obama administration, now it's even getting worse, is just this tremendous divide on issues that makes policy making so much more difficult.
Yeah, the media gets a lot of criticism for not getting out and talking to people that they should talk to. I guess I'm always, when I file something, think like who is actually reading it and how. It's hard to measure impact and actually know if you're not doing what you're supposed to be doing. But I don't know, like if the mayor of Phoenix talks about water, like are people in rural Arizona going to care, and vice versa? Like it's these millennial leaders. I don't know. It just seems like just having a new group of leaders doesn't change these kind of imbalance that you're talking about.
Well, I think we have to count on them to do that. I think that slowly, I think their style of governance is changing. So in New Mexico, we have mayors from the 3 large metropolitan areas conducting sustainability conferences in each other's communities, where they all get together and they talk about everybody being in the boat together and having to figure out these issues, especially water, jobs, et cetera, et cetera. So they are starting to see it that way, which I think is good, that they're willing to cross municipal boundaries or whatever and have these discussions. It's got to happen more. And I think what we can do, and I think about this in regards to my kids and grandkids, is consistently encouraging them to try to lead in a different way, because we all, in a sense, didn't didn't hold up our end of the bargain, get some of this stuff done. We've got to leave it to the next generation to help with it, and maybe we can give them some tips on how to reach across and find the consensus they need to spread the information, get good policy going.
Paul, can I ask you, your father bought those 2 ranches, am I right? And you probably have several other neighbors that are of an older generation than you are. I mean, how does that intergenerational conversation, I mean, do you find that you are approaching things from a different point of view, markedly from the older generation?
Oh, excuse me, absolutely. It's again one of those barriers because I think people get locked into the way that they do business. Ag producers are very proud people, and whether it's a crop that they grow or a breed of cattle that they believe in or a time of year that they believe bulls should be turned out, these are things that regardless of sometimes new science and new data, they stick with a program that works for them. Our particular area is fairly challenging with that. With such a small growth season, our opportunities to have profitable ranches are minimal. And so getting the younger generation excited and interested in continuing in family agriculture legacy certainly is a challenge.
So what works? Like what's worked with that you've experienced? Like how do you kind of frame the conversation so that actually you can make progress if you're trying to get what you think should happen to happen when you're talking to somebody from an older generation that might want to stick with the program like you said?
Well, we've been very fortunate as a family. My father believed in his children a long time ago, which was pretty unique. And everything that we've attempted to do specific with the river project or relative to neighbors, we never wanted to force or shove or be aggressive in any way about telling our neighbors what they should do. We felt that the best way we could do this is by demonstrating what was possible. So we always tried to seek, and whether it was an in-the-ground project, a conceptual project through a partnership, we just wanted to open the door and make available the same opportunities that we had and what we were working on. And one of the highlights of my time working on this project is the landowner that was probably the single largest naysayer showed up on cleanup day of a 4-day construction project and was looking at it and said to me directly that this is incredible. Is there any chance that we can do this on my place? And I just kind of smiled and said that's been the plan all along.
You didn't say I told you so.
I was delicate in what I said. But as far as the overall elevations with the river and what we were working on with riffles and different elevations for intakes, it always was part of the project. We just waited till they were ready to get on board.
That's interesting. So when is he going to get his done, or did it happen already?
It was constructed the first week of December 2018.
Wow. I wanted to ask you, Terry, about the work that you're doing in New Mexico. You said connecting people with funding that they don't access typically. Is there, where's my question? It's, do people hesitate to work with you ever? Is that, is it, again, kind of getting them to do something they haven't done before? Can you talk about the process of doing that?
Sure. I think it's important to understand, New Mexico, obviously we're sitting at the edge of this basin, mostly to the east and south of folks. In New Mexico, we have 400 water users associations, and those are associations of less than 10 users up to 9,000. We have in San Juan County, where you have the San Juan River running through, a third of the residents get their water from a local association. And I was looking it up the other day. There's an association of 1,900 users. The head of the board is the local chiropractor. And I wrote a story not long ago about Jesse Gomez, who's a water manager at Blue Water, which is a lake near Gallup. He's got 200 users on the system. When he took over the system about 10 or 20 years ago, they handed him a shoebox with a wrench and a checkbook. And they said, here's your water system. The water system was constructed with 3/4-inch PVC and metal pipes, and they were pumping the water from the lake uphill, and it didn't work very well. And Jesse, who was ran an auto body shop, had to learn how to apply for a $1 million federal loan and take on that debt as a water system to get a new tank and replace the lines. And we are asking that of people all across this space in a sense. asking them to figure out really tough federal regulations, state regulations, learn how to take out a loan from the federal government, which seems incredibly intimidating. I don't know how many people in this room could do that, but these are the things we demand of folks. So they're very, in a sense, skittish of this whole situation. These are community folks who are your water managers across this basin that have to learn how to bill their neighbors every month, apply for federal loans, and do all that. So we try to come in and offer some of that technical assistance to make it less intimidating. But there's far few of us, and the federal government's cutting those programs that offer technical assistance. The president, in his first budget, suggested that rural water systems be privatized, which would be a dramatic change in a state like New Mexico. And I don't know how some of those folks will get their water in a private system scenario. So what we try to do is understand what the hurdles are in understanding this whole system, how to get a federal loan or a federal grant or do some study that needs to be done, and then give them a grant writer or give them some financial analysis or some other tools, and hopefully teach them the skills along the way so that they can do that over and over again. What we saw at USDA in our water programs is once a water system figured us out, they came back every single time they needed money. It's similar to the farm loan programs. Once a farmer figures out how to get an FSA loan, they can do it over and over and over again. So if you teach folks to do this stuff, we feel like it's going to be beneficial to New Mexico. And I want to stress that when we talk about these big, heady issues of water policy, you have an army of people out there that need to be, your true believers on this stuff. And that's going all the way down to some guy who's the local chiropractor who's trying to also run a water system for 1,900 homes at night when he gets home from work. That person has to be on board with these things that we're talking about at this conference. So it really is, it struck me taking that federal job that I had and visiting 154 New Mexico towns, the people that are doing this stuff as a part-time job, managing major projects and water systems and federal loans and state loans and grants and such. It's a very intimidating process.
They're coming to you, or are you kind of going to them?
They're doing both. Mm-hmm. So we go to them. So we'll talk to the New Mexico Rural Water Association and all of their 400 or so members. But then also we get sent people who are looking for help. And the other thing that we run into, I'll just say real quickly, is our water managers are getting very old. It's a weird phenomenon in New Mexico, but it's similar to our farmers. We have the oldest average age farmer of any state in the union at 66 years old. And farmers are aging out of the systems. Our water managers and boards of directors are aging out of the system. And there aren't people coming in at 20 years old or 30 years old that want to take over that water system and start billing their neighbors $80 a month for water and getting into fights with people. So the system is changing dramatically in our state. And so we are talking also with a lot of these groups about sustainable approaches to drinking water management, where they create regional organizations that absorb a lot of these water associations and become maybe more efficient and such. So we have kind of a dramatic change happening on that front.
So if they don't combine, then what happens? Like, let's say, what happens if nobody takes it out?
Well, I think they just gradually die off, and that's a shame. New Mexico's, again, in a very unique position. We're just starting to recover from the recession. In 2016, we had our first year in 150 years of population loss. So New Mexico decreased in population while a lot of you were growing. So we have people are moving away from these rural areas and old water systems, and a lot of old practices are dying off.
Kirsten, I wanted to ask you a little bit about your work at Heal the Bay. You had talked a little bit before about it, how it was a little bit more on the left side or further left than some other groups. So what was different about how that organization went about getting what it wanted? What's the, I guess I'll stop with that.
Yeah, so it is interesting coming from that space where I worked for about 10 years at a more traditional environmental nonprofit, grassroots, using the community, save the whales type approach. And then now, comparing that to Ceres, which is a sustainability group. And at the end of the day, we want, a lot of the same things, but we're coming at it from sort of that economic perspective. And, I think, both are valid. We need both, sort of perspectives coming to the table on these decisions. But it is interesting. I see how powerful, in Sacramento it is bringing in those economic and job arguments. And I remember, when I was at Heal the Bay, we were working on some beach water quality issues because there were a large number of recreators that were getting sick because of the bacteria in the water. And, we were trying to think of, well, how can we get the tourism angle and, the hotels on the beach to start thinking about it, because we realized that the power of those economic arguments. And so that's what we're really doing at Ceres. And, it can be so powerful in bringing those to legislators in Sacramento. There are a lot of folks think that, it's California, they'll pass anything progressive, but that's really a misconception. Yes, we have a supermajority of Democrats in both the House and the Senate, but there's many shades of blue, and we have to bring in those economic arguments that really resonate, and are very valid, that legislators can consider. And so it really opens eyes when you start bringing in sort of the dollar signs.
Would you say that the kind of it's healthier and better for all of us argument is like works less well?
I wouldn't go that far. I mean, I think they're both very valid. I think those types of arguments will resonate with certain decision makers. But they're just, both powerful arguments. And when you bring in the dollar signs, it definitely, can be impactful. And like I said, at the end of the day, we're driving for a lot of the same solutions. And so it's great to have both perspectives. And now I have, my colleagues that I worked very closely with on a day-to-day basis when I was at Heal the Bay, now trying to engage me in their coalitions and their campaigns that are working on these water policies, but could really use some of that business perspective. And so what I try to do is, frame it in that economic way and complement what they're doing.
Mm-hmm. And if anybody wants to ask a question, please, by all means. I want to talk a little bit about emotions and assumptions. So do people in these conversations that get so difficult, do you find emotions to be helpful, or are they kind of a barrier? I don't know who wants to take that, Paul. Do you want to start? I mean, I imagine I've done enough reporting to know that people are pretty emotional about their water, and because of the financial implications of it, but just also because of the history of it. So I don't know. How do you handle the really heightened emotions of the issue?
I think it goes both ways, and at the right time, it can be necessary. Grand County's former manager, Lurleen, I was at a meeting with her one time with many important people, and I rode with her to this meeting, and she stood up and she slammed her pen on the table and she said, "You're wasting my time. Please call me when you have something to say." And she turned around and started walking out, and she was my ride, and I was sitting there, and I was kind of didn't really know what to do. Okay, see. But I think that
that ended the meeting. Yeah.
And what she did for Grand County, where I live though, in the greater partnerships that have trickled down from that, is she did bring a human side to it in an area in a valley that she grew up in that she was so passionate about. And I think that trickle-down effect created partnerships and relationships that are still bound. And at the time, it was necessary, instead of it being Grand County fighting larger scale water utilities or other entities, a county of 14,000 people, it became personal between Lurleen and the people that she was sitting with, and a very necessary emotion, although I have seen the other side of that too.
Yeah, well, tell us about that. I mean, when does it not work?
When people get very proud of how they operate. And so back on to the river project side of things, the emotion of a family to have any kind of an admission that perhaps how they've been operating their particular pump or their ag operation in the meadow isn't as efficient as it could have been, or isn't as productive as it could have been. those become some really challenging conversations to have. And I understand the emotion there. Their private property rights and things they've worked for generations are on the line. So it's a little bit of a slippery slope in how delicate you have to be with those conversations.
I want to ask, like, what works again? I mean, did you find anything what's the technique that you use if it starts to get to a place where?
Well, I think a whole nother story that I'll probably spend too long answering this now, but another thing that happened with my family when we relocated up to Grant County, one of the ranches that my father acquired, the water rights had been purchased from Denver Water back in 1963, and there was a 50-year leaseback agreement set to expire in 2013. When we acquired the ranch, we acquired same contract, a few changes. Well, then the drought happened, and completely correct per contract, Denver, and it was necessary in the drought, and they had full right to pull those water rights from being used on lands that we own. The problem for us is that we knew that day was coming in 2013, but the business model of payment to the bank kind of worked while using that water in the in-between time frame. So in the beginning, my father made some connections and some relationships with some staff at Denver Water. It seemed to improve and help the situation, but these are emotional things when your ranch is on the line based on some bank payments that you can or can't make, and the difference of what that water would mean. Slowly over time, we're talking maybe 4 to 5 years later, then I'm meeting with the head of raw water supply for Denver, over a casual lunch, having a conversation about why those water rights are important to my family and what it means. And as I got to know, this gentleman and his family history and his wife's family history, we found out how many common connections that we had, and it was driven through emotion to be sitting in those conversations, but then playing it out and dealing with it with a level head, and something that we're so grateful for Denver Water and Grant County. And I think that's something that's a little bit understated sometimes, or some of the great projects that have been implemented. In that whole arrangement led to a study of the Big Lake Ditch, partnered with Denver and Grant County. And from 2013 to present date, my family has been irrigating every year. There were 3 points to that study, 3 objectives, I should say, to maintain historical agriculture uses, to maximize environmental benefits, and to substantially preserve the yield of water that Denver anticipates associated with its portion of the Big Lake Ditch demand. And we are implementing and living out those agreements, working on all sides of that. And it's been an incredible partnership. And while it's a smaller area, the thing, we talk about all the water issues that we work on all the time and how overwhelming they can be. But I think that a piece at a time and a moment at a time, with the right partners, we have potentials to create great solutions.
Terry, you were nodding your head.
Yeah, I would agree. And I would think that on the emotional nature of water, in New Mexico, we have some very long-term cultural traditions around water. We have the acequia system, which is a system of irrigation ditches that dates back to the Spanish, and some would say to North Africa or whatnot, that were brought here. And they are not only community ditch associations, they're governments, and they're recognized by the state, and they function within a sense, a mayor of that system. And that was the form of governance for centuries in some of these areas. And getting them to change water management obviously has a lot of emotion tied to it. And getting farmers to stop flood irrigating because they have a use it or lose it mentality in New Mexico on using their water rights. Those are habits that are ingrained. And I think the way you change them and avoid, too much, in a sense, emotional confrontation over it is to create good places for people to have dialogue, continue the dialogue, keep talking, keep educating one another, sharing information. When we in our state have shared information about water, encouraged people to water less or use it differently, and spent the time to explain it with folks, then the emotionality tends to drift away a little bit because people are getting decent information. But once you let your foot off the pedal and you stop trying to spread the information, you see those old ingrained habits and emotions come forward again. So it's constant work, I think, to educate one another.
Ariana, I see you. I just have one question. So, I feel like as a journalist, I'm kind of trained to look for conflict because that often makes a good story. And there's good and bad reasons for using that as a guide for a story, but what would indicate to you all that the conflict in a given situation and therefore the emotion is actually a real and true reflection of something that's high stakes rather than kind of somebody grandstanding or blowing hot air? Because sometimes it's hard to tell, honestly, if it's a real thing. I mean, that's what you have to get on the phone and call people to find out. But I feel like emotion and a conflict is a way to attract attention that might not be deserved. So I don't know if you want to talk about that, maybe.
Well, one thing that comes to mind for me is an issue that we're working on closely in California, which is around safe and affordable drinking water. So obviously Flint made the news, a few years back. And a lot of folks don't know that about 1 million California residents don't have access to safe and affordable drinking water. So that has become a really emotional issue, which, actually I think has helped move the public policy dialogue forward. A lot of these communities are lower income and, rural areas that don't get much, thought in the capital. And so, the coalition working on this is really bringing those voices and the folks that it's impacting personally to Sacramento. In fact, in Governor Newsom's, I think, 3rd day of office, he took his full cabinet on a bus to one of these impacted areas and talked to the residents. So I think, that's a case where emotion really was helpful.
Right, to get media attention for that. I mean, but that, important issue, I mean, there's probably some things that are not so important that people are using the same tactic. I don't know. I feel like I see that sometimes, the press conference where people are, trying to tug on our heartstrings, but it, may or may not be a thing.
Yeah. I think you can use your powers of good or evil in this situation, and you can try to push forward a positive agenda on some of it. But yeah, people are there's no shortage of marches on New Mexico State Capitol over a particular issue, right? And water runs into that very often. And it wasn't very long ago where we had some pretty serious, almost armed conflicts in New Mexico over water rights. And people wave, as the governor said, the bloody shirt every once in a while.
Yeah.
One example of where we saw something like you articulated is in the discussion around reducing plastic pollution in California. That's been a big focus, especially with ocean plastics. And we did see a lot of instances of press conferences where, some of these, smaller companies that would be manufacturing some of these things would, bring workers and, maybe true, maybe not, but it seemed like some of it was just the companies saying, hey, you're going to, you lose your job if you don't speak out against this plastic pollution reduction policy. So that's one that comes to mind where, sometimes it can be used a little bit counter. Yeah.
Hi, thanks. So, Paul, you mentioned the Trout Unlimited cooperation and working on rancher land to, I assume these are like stream improvement projects for fish and that'll help fishing access onto that these ranchers' lands. So I'm wondering, do those kinds of projects give ranchers more flexibility with provisions like use it or lose it, or fears of that, to say leave more water in the river for fishing access and this other kind of income stream? Are you seeing any of that happen in your area where people are sort of maybe cutting back in their own use or being more efficient in their own use to leave more water for uses like recreation?
Yeah, so I think that every valley and area is so unique, and the headwaters of the Colorado River, for the very reason that these landowners didn't have water rights prior to the CBT project, is you look at the hydrograph and you're taking the big peak off by some of these bigger projects. And so it becomes very interesting to talk to conservation organizations, which there were a number of conversations in the beginning about, should that valley move to all more efficient irrigation techniques than flood? But our flood's been taken away, and so it's the replacement and a healthy riparian corridor, because all of these lands that I am talking about are very much within the riparian corridor of the Colorado River itself. But what happened for us was, not only did we lose so much of our flow, but it was just very unnatural and bizarre how the river seemed like it was just so far down there. Where's the river? So part of our project and what the assessment brought forward is that there was an old oxbow of the Colorado River that was approximately 1.75 miles long that no one knew. There had been a little dredge operation of about 300 feet back in the first decade of the 1900s, and so it shortened the length of the river by about 1.5 miles. So the river for over 100 years has been trying to find a new healthy balance of slope and elevation and velocity, and so it was eating itself alive, incising down into the bed. So where we were very fortunate working with these conservation partners, and something that was identified immediately is the first thought is to, well, just lower the pumps and chase the water and pump it back up. But if we're flood irrigating lands and the water table's here and the surface of the meadow's here, it's almost like a sponge. So instead of chasing the water and trying to fill a bigger void, we have gone down and we've elevated the river channel back to a studied historic place. We're not completely altering what was natural, but we've brought that water table up upwards of 2 feet in certain locations, which, as the pumps operate, as a natural byproduct of this, there's much less void to fill and the groundwater is available. That being the case, in certain circumstances, a landowner that would take up to 12 days to spread water on their meadow is now having cycles of less than 3 to shut the pumps off. Additionally, a byproduct of this, which it was no secret to the landowners that we ran a small-scale fishing business, but it certainly wasn't the intention of this project that we were building fish habitats so we could lease their places. That was not the intention, but certainly as a byproduct, we were actually somewhat shocked how quickly the improved habitat was promoting healthy fish populations. And these areas that we have now taken on 3 leases of landowners that we have worked on their places without ever intending that that would happen. And it's very nice recreational income for these producers, helping them to continue to stay in business. And once they start to see that opportunity, it kind of, it's just kind of that little spark, because they realize there's more ways than one to earn a living. Of course, I think for everyone there, you know, the agriculture sustainability is the critical kind of foundation of what they're going to do. But, you know, just as a case in my family, you know, having recreational income to help make tractor payments and payments on notes on livestock and backhoes you can't afford. And I'm sorry, I guess.
Well, so what are the farmers, the ranchers that don't have that other tax or that other revenue stream? Do they make it? How do they have some other revenue stream? You know, like you guys are using the 2 businesses together, right?
Yeah, I mean, every place is different. In Grand County, because of our short growth season and where we are at current market times, you have to be a very creative rancher if that's the only source of revenue that you have to maintain. And if you operate very efficiently, you can make it work. But almost everyone has some other form. So they might be in the business of excavation, or they might have a hunting outfitter or some capacity to help make things work.
Mm-hmm. How much do we got? 3 minutes. Something you said to me on the phone, Paul, was about that. I think you said lawyer-to-lawyer communication was helpful at one point. Just when you were
Easy now.
Yeah. I mean, Governor Babbitt, you know, he said earlier today that, you know, legions of lawyers are lusting for litigation over some of this river stuff. But I remember covering the drought contingency plan. There's lots of lawyers in the room who clearly like were working on it and not wanting to end up in court. It seems like court is where things go to die, right? Compromise goes to die.
So the group of landowners that were the ILVK, there's some old contracts and things that I don't want to get that deep. It gets very complicated. But it was moving in a direction where it looked like there could be some very interesting lawyer-to-lawyer conversations that would happen. Fortunately, before that ever got very serious, we actually formed a partnership with that particular utility that has led to additional partnership. And what I haven't really had a chance to talk about yet is the ILVK reach on the Colorado River is about 12 miles. Well, there's 2 other major projects that are going on that Northern Water and Denver Water are involved in above us. That's called the Habitat Restoration Project. And then there's another project above that, a shallow reservoir in the main stem of the Colorado River. And in avoiding kind of the litigation mode and where that could have turned out, when the ag producers were looking at applying for a large-scale federal grant, we had the opportunity through, again, our great partners to look at combining all 3 projects into one in what's known as the Colorado River Headwaters Project. And we applied for a regional conservation partnership program through the NRCS. And collectively, we were awarded $7.85 million from that single request. And that was a moment of literally the ranchers that were almost in litigation with a major water, well, with Northern Water and Northern Subdistrict. Now we are partners on a common project to build a connectivity channel and take an online reservoir basically offline and reconnect the Colorado River channel. And it was voted unanimously by the same ag producers that were in such conflict years ago.
Any concluding thoughts about compromise and the assumptions that we make about each other and how to kind of get past that? I don't know if there's anything you didn't say that you would have wished you had the chance to.
I mean, just a concluding thought is, I mean, our sort of theory of change is that we need, businesses and investors to really better understand the value of water and come to the table and be part of the discussions and, the compromise if necessary to help move forward with sustainable water supplies in California and beyond.
Yeah, I would say that we also have to give people options along these river areas and riparian areas or the basin or whatever you want to call it. I mean, one thing that we see in New Mexico is the minute the economy goes bad, it's time to go, take your backhoe and take the gravel out of the river and sell it. So let's have a better option for folks who want to create revenue. Let's think of ways that you can create business opportunities like fly fishing or whatever it is that you can do that makes it so you don't have to go into an extractive kind of process around natural resources to survive. But that's what we see is the minute the economy goes bad, you forget about growing tomatoes and instead you're going to grow alfalfa and sell it on the side of the road because you can make money now. So how do you set up a better economic situation for everybody in the basin so that they have better options in front of them?
So how do you do that?
Well, we're kind of working on that. I've had an idea to create something like the Delta Regional Authority for this basin and create some federal programs that specifically address the economic needs in this area. So that affects demand management in such a way that, again, people have other options rather than pulling water out of the river, and they can protect the rivers. So can we create maybe investors around that type of process and people that want to see through opportunity zones, economic growth in areas around the river? So there's all these types of things that I think we could employ to have a more conscious strategy beyond just water management.
Actually, we have a few more minutes than I had thought. So one thing I didn't get to was leadership. And how important is that, right? Setting the tone. I guess like the Driscoll CEO story, I would love for you to tell a little bit about that. And just that kind of how instrumental it was, like the actual, like how it changed people's minds.
Yeah, so this sort of in a way inspired the creation of our Connect the Droughts campaign that I've been talking about, where in 2013, 2014, when we were, starting off with this epic drought that California faced, and, unable to get a groundwater law passed after many, many years and decades probably of debate. And so, Driscoll's berries, I believe probably everyone in this room has had a blackberry or raspberry or blueberry from Driscoll's. And one of their biggest growing regions is around, along the coast in California and a couple areas of the coast. And, the unique feature about the coastal area is that it's pretty much only sourced by groundwater. And so, the CEO of Driscoll's, Miles Ryder, very savvy. His family has owned this company for decades. He's a grower himself, and he recognized that his basins were being overdrafted and that, 10, 20 years down the line, if something wasn't done and if they didn't really think collaboratively with all the straws that were in the basin and coming up with some sort of plan for putting the basin back in balance, that he was going to be out of business. And so it's a really inspirational story where he got engaged in the discussions in Sacramento around the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act. And, you had a very divisive discussions, very confrontational, different agricultural groups were not on board. And Miles, came to the table and really, put the reality out there that he might not be in business.
Whose support did he win over that wouldn't have been there otherwise?
I think a lot of the moderate Democrats. So, there's many moderate Democrats that are beholden to different interest groups that weren't supportive of this. And so I think that sort of reality helped. I mean, there's many variables, obviously, but it helped break free. And the neat part is that, I've gone up to Ventura County, where is a big growing region, and they have a staff member who's on the ground in all of the meetings, because this is one of the basins that's been identified in the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act of needing to be addressed. And they have a staff member who's going to all of the meetings with the various growers and, the water agencies, and is in the weeds of developing this plan, because they really recognized it was valuable to be at the table and to try to have a consensus driven approach. And he's definitely had his challenges, I know, in speaking with him, but a lot of folks are now looking at that basin and a lot of the work that's been done, and a lot of NGOs have put some time and effort into that basin because they think it can potentially serve as a model for others. But it's a great example of just, how different stakeholders coming to the table can really, break free the logjam.
Right.
Yeah, I don't know if this is the right group, but a lot of people, when they talk about the less water in the river, they say, oh, we're just going to buy off farmers. It'll be fine. That'll be super easy. We'll throw money at them. They'll love to just sit around and get money and not grow. Is that farsighted and smart, or super naive and ignorant?
Well, I think sometimes when everyone is in their independent corners looking at their own perspective of water, it's important that we remember that, we all need to eat. And sometimes ag is just referred to as ag, but we really don't grow food for the world. This is the business that we're in. And I think that I'm excited right now for opportunities related to demand management, because I think from an upper basin perspective, if we don't find ways to creatively sustain agriculture while finding consumptive savings, then I think the answer becomes what the gentleman just proposed is going to happen. And if we find ourselves years down the road in a place where we've lost our farmers, we've lost our productive agriculture locations to grow food, I think as a society in general, as a basin, as a state, as a country, we've made a critical mistake. And I think we have to work together to find innovative solutions to prevent that from happening. And proud to be working on some of those.
Could it, maybe what the argument for doing that is just shifting more agriculture to where there is more water? I guess that's something I hear quite a bit.
Yeah, my wife is from the Northeast, and my father-in-law, I've spent time touring all over New York and New Jersey with him. And the thing is there as well, it may not be the water issue. There's other issues there where a lot of this country's most productive ag land is no longer in ag. And it's something that we need to start thinking about. It's not just a water related, West crisis. And I find though that, I think this was titled in this panel, is that drinking whiskey in moderation equals to innovative water solutions. Is that what it was called?
You mean the
I just want to see if you guys could laugh.
Well, thank you very much to our panel. Thank you to the audience for your great questions also.
Thanks.
Yeah.